All right, we all know what we experienced last year. We come out of a tornado and we come right into a drought. And I don't know what y'all's pasture looks like, but everything I've been looking at this year is not in the best of shape. So, Dr. Chris Teutsch is the Forest Extension Specialist at the Research and Education Center, which is in the rebuilding process. Actually, things start to come together, fences and things coming up. So, we asked if he would spend just a little bit of time talking, maybe give some ideas for renovating these pastures for coming up this spring. So, Dr. Teutsch, thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Shane. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm wearing a microphone, but it's not to amplify my voice. We're capturing this presentation as a video, and then it'll be on our KY Forage's YouTube site. We've got over 400 videos of all things related to forage and livestock management on that site. So I would invite you to visit that site if you haven't had the chance to. As Shane alluded to, we've kind of had a tough year. Had the tornado, and then we moved into a drought, intermittent drought last summer and the last fall, and that caused a lot of our pastures to be a little bit overgrazed, and that kind of weakened our stands and opened them up, and got a few weed problems this spring, and it would be good if we could get those open spots filled in with something that we want. And that's kind of what this presentation is talking about what we can do right now to kind of fill those gaps into our pastures. And then on top of all this, we've had some significant rain events. In fact, just last week we had a significant rain event, about 3 inches or so of rain, and that certainly doesn't help with pugging in pastures and hoof damage to pastures. We're going to talk a little bit about that. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll give you a quick update on the research station. We're making some pretty good progress. I feel like we had a company come in over the last 3 weeks or so, and they demolished all of our foundations because no reputable building company would rebuild onto an old foundation. So they've demolished those, hauled them away. They're crushing that for rock, and we're going to put that back on our roadways at the research station. We've got a majority of our fences back. We lost about 8 miles of fence or so at the research station, and those are kind of in the finishing stages. We got some internal fences to do. So we're making good progress, and we've got some office trailers there. They're a trailer, but they're much better than we had last year, which was nothing, right? So I'm pretty happy to have good internet and a place to sit down. So I think we're making good progress. Our goal is to have the research station rebuilt by 2025, which is the 100th anniversary of the research station. All right, so let's go ahead and get started here. Plug this in. Well, there we go. So we're seeing a lot of pastures that kind of look like this, and it's a factor of drought and rainfall and then feeding close. And of course, as we get closer to where we're feeding at, we're going to have more disturbance, right? And a lot of times we look at that and we just lose our minds because we think we've lost the whole pasture. But what I want to challenge you to do tonight is just take a closer look at your pastures. A lot of times we'll have areas like this that are pretty disturbed and need to be reseeded, but we'll have a lot of areas that are kind of have light or medium disturbance in our pastures. I'm going to move my computer up here. My advancer doesn't seem to be working well. So when we think about damage in pastures, there's two things we need to think about, especially from hoof damage, and that's how deep that hoof has gone in the soil. Sometimes it's only an inch or so. That's pretty light damage, but when we get down to 2 to 3 inches, that can be some moderate damage. And then we want to think about the extent of the disturbance. So when we look at at the pasture, how much of it's disturbed. Is it 50%? Is it 25%? And when we do that, we can use this matrix. This was from a guy in New Zealand came up with this. And essentially what it's showing us is that if we look at the depth of the damage and the extent of the damage, we can kind of classify this into either being light, severe, or very severe damage. And then from there, we can kind of develop a plan on what we're going to do with that pasture. So once we put it in one of those categories, we can kind of figure out whether we're just going to give it a little tender, loving care and let it rest a little bit, whether we're going to overseed some clover, whether we need to do a complete renovation of that pasture. And that's kind of what I want to talk just a little bit about, is those three options. So in this particular picture, we have pretty light damage. So there's maybe about 20% disturbance in this particular photo, and some hoof damage, but not very deep. Now, I know none of you are going to go home and get out a quadrat and start to quantify your pastures, but why I'm showing you this is that I want you to think about and really look at the damage rather than having a knee-jerk reaction to it. So just take a few minutes and walk through your pasture and just look and see what kind of damage you have and kind of get a feel for the overall condition of that pasture. Now, I do know that there's at least two people in here that are going to be using quadrats to measure pasture damage. You know who those are? Taylor Wynn and Whitney Peck. They're two of my students that work out at the research station, and we're very to have them. And we've been working on a bale grazing study this winter with these two young ladies, and they've done a really good job at helping us collect a tremendous amount of data that we'll be presenting to you guys shortly on bale grazing. So the idea of the quadrat is not necessarily that everybody's going to go home and do it, but just to get you to stop and not have a knee-jerk reaction and just look at what you actually have in that pasture. So when we kind of quantify this disturbance, we got 20 or 25% disturbance in pretty shallow pugging. You know, that damage is going to be pretty light. Those pastures are going to recover pretty quickly from that with just a little extra rest and making sure that our soil fertility is good. So when we have that light, the very light damage, again, this is all stuff that you already know, so I'm just reminding you, we need to make sure that our soil fertility is where it needs to be. We've had a couple years with extremely high fertilizer prices. And what's that mean? That means we pull back on the fertility a little bit. And when we do that, we can drive our nutrient levels in the soils down, especially if we started out in that medium minus or low range to start with. So it's important to get a soil test, figure out where you're at. We can't manage something that we don't measure. So it's important to get that soil test and adjust fertility. If we need lime, this is a great time to put lime on. It's our best buy in terms of all of our soil amendments. When we neutralize soil acidity, bring that pH up between 6 and 7, we're making every other nutrient in that pasture more available to the plants that are growing in that pasture. So a lot of times a pasture that has light or very light damage just needs a little extra care, a little extra recovery time. Take it easy on it this spring. Maybe interseed a little bit of clover and then graze it lightly this spring and kind of allow it to rest a little bit and recover. So one of the things that I want to talk about, and probably one of our most important agronomic practices, is frost seeding clover into pastures. Now we're getting a little bit on the short end of the frost seeding window. We've had most of our freeze and thaw events, so at this point in time, we may want to look at the next slide, which is no-tilling into pastures if we want to try to get pasture plants established. So what frost seeding is simply broadcasting that seed on the soil surface, and then the freezing and thawing that happens during the day and night causes little cracks to form in that soil and then incorporates that clover seed into that pasture. For it to be successful, you've got to get the seed out early enough, and normally that's in February sometime. And then it has plenty of freezing and thawing events to incorporate that seed into the soil. As we get into early March, we need to think about switching from frost seeding into actually no-till drilling. And when we no-till drill, we're actually putting that seed in contact with the soil. We're not counting on those freezing and thawing cycles to get that seed incorporated. So One of the important things to remember about frost seeding, if you did get some clover out, make sure you control competition in the spring. So as the sods start to grow this week, and really they can get up and around these little clover seedlings that have just germinated and really shade them out and compete for sunlight and nutrients. So it's important to keep that competition down. The best way to do that is to graze those pastures. And by grazing those pastures, we're keeping that canopy open, allowing sunlight into those clover seedlings that are developing within that stand. Make sure you use high quality seed, and by high quality seed I mean a named seed variety or a certified seed variety. So we can get Kenland, and Kenland is still one of our best red clover varieties, but make sure you get Kenland certified. It's got a blue tag on it. If you just get Kenland, there's no guarantee that you're actually getting Kenland seed in that bag. If it's uncertified seed, there's no rule that it has to be what it says on the bag. So it's important that you get certified seed. We've shown in variety trials that we get a 30 to 40% yield increase when we use certified Kenland versus just variety not stated Kenland seed. Make sure you use a correct seeding rate, and make sure you get even seed distribution when you broadcast that seed onto the pasture. And that's often easier said than done, right? It's hard to see where we've been when we're driving with an ATV broadcasting seed in the pasture. We can actually use a small GPS unit that are portable to help us see where we've been in pastures. This is just a general seeding mix that's a pretty good, solid recommendation, 6 to 8 pounds of red clover per acre, a pound or 2 of ladino clover, which is a large white clover. White clover comes in 3 types, a large white or ladino, a medium grazing type of white clover that's kind of intermediate in stature and intermediate in yield, and then we have our common white clover, which tends to be lower growing and yield about a third as much. If we've got pastures that are a little bit lower in fertility, so if we're renting some ground and we've got pastures lower in fertility, annual Lespedeza may not be a bad choice to put in that seeding mixture. And annual Lespedeza is a warm season annual legume. It does better on lower fertility soils than our clovers will do. And it's one that we've kind of forgotten about over time. You know, 60 or 70 years ago, we used a lot of annual Lespedeza in grazing systems because we didn't have as ready of access to lime and fertilizer. So just mention no-till seeding. So as we get into early March and we're not having a lot of freezing and thawing cycles to incorporate the clover seed into the pastures, our better bet is to no-till seed that in. Then we're guaranteeing that seed gets in contact with the soil, and that's what we've got to have for that seed to germinate, come up, and produce a viable seedling. And again, we want to reduce the amount of plant residue. When we have a lot of residue, we kind of hinder seed placement because we're pushing that residue down into the drill slit and we're not getting good soil to seed contact. So close grazing prior to no-tilling that pasture is going to be really good for improving seed placement. And we want to make sure and calibrate our drill. We don't talk enough about that, but when we're only seeding 6 or 7 pounds of seed per acre, you know, if I'm off 5 pounds, it's not a big deal if I'm seeding 120 pounds of a small grain, but it's a pretty big deal if you're seeding a little bit of clover. So make sure and calibrate your seed. And we've got a really nice calibration video on our website and a nice calibration publication that Shane can get you if you're interested. So check and recheck your seeding depth. Probably the biggest reason that we see stand failures with small seeded forages and no-tilling is that we put the seed too deep in the soil. How deep should a small seeded forage be seeded? Any guesses? Taylor? Very good. Oh, you read it off of here. I thought I actually taught her something, and she's just reading it off the slide. So, good job, Taylor. Yeah, we don't want to go deeper than 1/2 inch with small seeded forages, you know, and if it's a little bit shallower than that, then that's probably even better. So a general rule that I use with no-till drills, if I'm not seeing a little bit of seed along that drill slit, we're probably going too deep with that seed. So, and again, control competition after seeding. So actually feeding a little hay on a pasture after you no-till it or frost seed it, it seems like we shouldn't do that, but it's actually a good thing because those animals are picking around and keeping that sod reduced and opening that canopy up so those seedlings can develop. And this is a nice seed mixture. Again, we've got our legumes. The nice thing about the no-till drill is that we can add some grass to that stand with the no-till drill. Generally speaking, frost seeding doesn't work real well for grasses like orchard grass and tall fescue. So if we need a grass to thicken our stand up, we really need to be thinking about no-tilling rather than frost seeding. All right, so here's another quadrat, and this is kind of represents moderate damage. So we've got maybe, I don't know, 40 or 50% disturbance. We've got some deeper pugging action from the hooves in this one. And we can kind of figure 50 to 60% disturbance, moderately deep pugging. So we're going to be in kind of this moderate to maybe severe range in terms of the damage in our pastures. So what do we do with moderate damage? Well, we do the same thing we did with light. We start with our soil test. We need to make sure that we've got good soil fertility. And then we're probably going to need to thicken those stands up a little bit. And that's going to require overseeding some grasses and legumes. And if we're overseeding grasses, you know, for fescue, we want to be in that 15-pound range. Orchard grass, 8 to 10 pounds. And then we, of course, never want to give up an opportunity to seed a little bit of clover in our pastures because it's going to improve animal performance and it's going to fix nitrogen from the air into a plant available form. Who knows what percent nitrogen is in the air? Whitney? Uh-oh. Anybody know? 78%. So that's N2 gas. That's not available to the plant. Legumes take that N2 gas and make it into a form that can be used by the plant. So they're a really important part of a sustainable grassland ecosystems. Who can tell me about nitrogen price over the last 2 years? Been pretty crazy. And that really shows the importance of legumes and grazing systems. If we can kind of decouple ourselves from having to buy a lot of commercial nitrogen fertilizer, that's a good thing for grazing operations. Okay, if possible, you want a no-till drill if you have moderate pasture damage. And the reason why is that you're going to leave the plants that are there. So you're going to have some good plants there, even if you have 50% disturbance. You'll have some healthy plants there, and you want to leave as many of those as you can and kind of fill in between them. And if we do have to do tillage, we want to make sure that it's as light as possible so that we can try to preserve as many of those plants as we can. And we can broadcast that seed on and then come back and either drag it or caudipack it. And by dragging it or caudipacking it, we get that seed in better contact with the soil. And that's going to enhance germination and emergence. What about crabgrass? You're probably thinking this guy's lost his mind, right? We've had a war on crabgrass and row crops forever, but crabgrass is not a bad forage if it's in a pasture. And we used to say when I was in southern Virginia, if it wasn't for crabgrass and wiregrass, and that's what we call Bermuda grass, we'd have a lot of hungry cows in the summertime. So crabgrass is definitely an option, and overseeding a mixture of red clover and maybe annual lespedeza and crabgrass is not a bad thing to do this time of year. We can seed it in late winter or early spring. Smooth and broadcast it on, and if we can, roll it in with a caudipacker. 3 to 5 pounds of crabgrass, 5 or 6 pounds of red clover, maybe 8 to 10 pounds of annual lespedeza if we're on a little bit lower fertility area, and then somehow get that seed in contact with the soil. We can even use animals, right? If we put animals on that after we broadcast that seed on, they'll actually walk that seed into that pasture if we have a high enough stock density. And then we can graze it or hay it in the summer months, and then come back and seed a cool season grass in the fall. That can either be an annual. Remember, crabgrass is a warm season annual, so it's going to do well up until about September, October, somewhere in that, and it'll start to slow down in growth, and at first frost it's kind of gone. It acts as a perennial by prolific reseeding, so it produces a lot of seed during the growing season. So we need something to go in that pasture where the crabgrass was after frost comes, and that's going to be a cool season grass. It can be a small grain annual ryegrass, or even we can go back in and seed a perennial grass mixture like tall fescue, orchard grass, and clovers. Just to mention a couple things about crabgrass, well adapted to this whole Mid-South region. And it, again, is an annual that acts like a perennial, so it has to come back from seed every year, but it produces a lot of seed, and that shatters on the soil, making it a self-reseeder. Needs to be double cropped with a winter annual like ryegrass or a small grain. Good yield potential, outstanding forage quality. We can expect average daily gains in work that was done at the Noble Foundation in the range of 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds a day, unsupplemented. No prussic acid. This is actually a study that I did when I was in Virginia. This is 60 days after planting, and this is an improved type of crabgrass. We always think of the weedy types, slow growing types, but the improved varieties have been selected for increased dry matter production and more upright growth. This happens to be Red River crabgrass that was planted 60 days before this picture was taken. And this, I just put this in to show you the nitrogen response to crabgrass, and other summer annuals have the same response. So it had maximum production of 305 pounds of nitrogen. Don't ever put 305 pounds of nitrogen on crabgrass. You want to be down here on this straight part of the curve right here. So somewhere 100 to 150, and you would apply that as a split application, 60 pounds, maybe another 60 pounds to get you up to that 100 to 150 range. The point I want to make is that it responds well to nitrogen fertilizer. Okay? So if you have committed to use a summer annual, you have to commit to putting some nitrogen fertilizer on it to make sure that you're going to get that productivity out of that summer annual. So the last class I just want to mention is the severe impact, and that's where essentially everything has been disturbed, that entire sod. And we certainly have those places in pastures, right, where we fed hay at, where our mineral feeder was, around the waters, anywhere where animals congregated at, we're going to have this type of severe disturbance in the pasture. So what do we do with this? Again, we make sure that our soil fertility is where it needs to be, and then we need to think about reestablishing that forage base that we want. And that can be very difficult to do successfully in the spring. Normally, by the time that pastures dry out and we get things leveled out, we're getting into late spring or early summer. In seeding a cool season grass at that time, the chances of having a successful establishment are pretty slim. So, and we can have extremely high weed pressure. We know in disturbed areas, things like spiny amaranth, cocklebur, goosegrass, foxtails all like to grow, and that puts a lot of pressure on those little cool season seedlings that are trying to put a root system down and get established. Buttercup, yeah. You got a lot of buttercup this year for sure. So the question is do we try to reestablish it this spring or kind of wait until late summer? When we seed in late summer, we avoid a lot of these weeds temporally, so in time. So the weeds that are a bad problem are kind of getting through their life cycle by this fall, and that allows us to get our cool season grasses established more successfully in late summer, early fall. So one option is to use a summer annual smother crop. I can guarantee you if you don't put anything in these disturbed areas, they're going to be full of spiny pigweed and other summer annual broadleafs and grasses. So it's important that we get something growing there that's going to shade out some of those weeds and keeping them from germinating. And probably our best option is a sorghum Sudan grass. If we can get a sorghum Sudan grass established, we want to plant somewhere between 25 and 50 pounds. If your pocketbook can afford 50 pounds, you're going to get a faster stand and quicker canopy closure and less weed pressure. 25 pounds will even do a pretty good job at suppressing weeds. Your top choice, of course, is going to be sorghum Sudan. Pearl millet would probably be second. And Sudan grass would be a second also. And then we can graze it or use it for hay. And that's nice. So we're controlling weeds and having some good summer growth that we can graze or use for hay. And then after we graze or use it for hay, we can come in with a selective herbicide in the fall, glyphosate. And then no-till, that cleans up whatever's left in terms of weeds or other plants that we don't want. And then we can no-till in a cool season grass mix. And by doing this, we avoid the weeds in time because the bad weeds have gone through their life cycle. We shaded a lot out with our summer annual, and it allows us to come in and establish a nice cool season sod in the fall. Now, one thing to remember is that just because it comes out of the ground doesn't mean that plant's established, right? So we need to be careful with these new stands that we're reseeding. We can graze them, but we want to graze them lightly, especially that fall, spring. It takes about 18 months for a forage plant to get a solid root system down and become fully established. It doesn't mean we can't use them, it just means we have to not abuse them during that period of time. All right, is there any questions? Don't be shy.
So what about seed availability? So we used to say when we give our variety publications to folks that ask, pick you one or two of the top performers. Well, now we say pick 4 or 5 because you might not find the top 2 or 3 or 4 that you would like to have. So what's our seed availability for this year?
I think seed availability is decent. One thing that I'll mention is that, like Shane said, a lot of times some of the top performing varieties are not locally available. So if you want to get one of those varieties, it's important to get on it early and make sure that you find a seed source that's local. Shane can help you find those. If you're from another county, your extension agent can help you find those seed sources, or I can help you find those seed sources. And there are seed distributors in this region of the state that have a better selection of improved varieties than your local co-op would.
And I have noticed that sometimes when you go to a dealer, that what they have there is what they say they have. They have availability of a lot more than they know. It's a phone call, and they may not have met that rep yet or made that phone call yet. We can help make those connections. We have found some seeds since Dr. Teutsch has been here that never been in this area before just by calling the right person and having it available.
Sometimes the seed stocked by the local co-ops are priced to sell. And there are improved varieties that they can call up and order from in just having a day or two in many cases. Is there any other questions? All right. Well, thank you for your attention. I'll be around, and if you have any questions, just grab me. All right.